What happens when a judge chooses mercy over law? In Providence Municipal Court, Rhode Island, something extraordinary was about to unfold that would challenge everything we think we know about justice. Judge Frank Caprio sat behind his bench, facing a woman whose trembling hands couldn't stop shaking as she tried to explain why she couldn't pay her $300 parking fine. "Your Honor," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I lost my job 3 weeks ago. I have 2 kids and—" But before she could finish, the courtroom erupted. A sharp-tongued court reporter, Maria Santos, who had been documenting cases for 15 years, suddenly interrupted with a scoff that echoed through the silent room. "Another sob story," Santos muttered, just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Judge, we hear this every day. Rules are rules." Judge Caprio's eyes flashed. What happened next would leave everyone in that courtroom speechless. If you want to see how one moment of human compassion can silence the coldest critics, stay with us because what you're about to witness will restore your faith in humanity. The woman standing before Judge Frank Caprio was Sarah Martinez, a 34-year-old single mother whose world had crumbled 3 weeks earlier when the restaurant where she worked for 8 years suddenly closed down. The $300 parking ticket in her trembling hands represented more than just a fine. It was 3 weeks of groceries for her 2 children, ages 7 and 9. But this wasn't just any ordinary day in Providence Municipal Court. Sitting in the back row, taking notes for what she claimed would be an exposé on judicial bleeding hearts, was court reporter Maria Santos. Santos had built a reputation over 15 years for her harsh criticism of what she called soft judges who don't enforce the law. Santos had specifically requested to cover Judge Caprio's court that day, armed with her recorder and a predetermined narrative about how emotional judges were destroying the American legal system. She had already published 3 articles criticizing Caprio's compassionate approach to justice, calling him a danger to law and order. As Sarah Martinez approached the bench, her worn sneakers squeaking against the polished courtroom floor, Santos positioned her recording device and prepared to capture what she was certain would be another example of judicial weakness. "Mrs. Martinez," Judge Caprio began, his voice gentle but authoritative, "I see here you received a parking citation for $300. How do you plead?" Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke. "Guilty, Your Honor. But I—" She paused, looking at her children who sat in the gallery, their school backpacks at their feet. "I can't pay it right now. I lost my job, and—" That's when Maria Santos made her first move. "Objection, Your Honor," Santos called out, standing abruptly. Though court reporters typically remain silent observers, Santos had inserted herself into proceedings before, claiming her journalistic duty to ensure proper legal procedure. Judge Caprio's eyebrows raised. "Ms. Santos, you're not an attorney. You have no standing to object." But Santos wasn't backing down. "Judge Caprio, with all due respect, we have laws for a reason. This woman parked illegally, got caught, and now wants sympathy instead of justice. How many working taxpayers are in this courtroom today who actually follow the rules?" But what Santos didn't realize was that Judge Caprio had been dealing with critics like her for decades, and he was about to teach her a lesson about the difference between law and justice that would leave her speechless. The courtroom fell completely silent. Sarah Martinez looked between the judge and the reporter, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Her 2 children, sensing the tension, moved closer together in their seats. Judge Caprio slowly removed his glasses, a gesture those familiar with his courtroom knew meant he was about to deliver something significant. "Ms. Santos," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years on the bench, "since you seem so concerned about proper legal procedure, let me ask you a question." Santos straightened her shoulders, confident she was about to prove her point about judicial accountability. "In your 15 years of covering this court, how many defendants have you seen who were truly unable to pay their fines?" Judge Caprio asked. "That's irrelevant, Your Honor. The law doesn't recognize poverty as—" "Answer the question, Ms. Santos." Santos hesitated. I don't keep track of such things. My job is to report on whether justice is properly administered." Judge Caprio leaned forward. "So you've spent 15 years in courtrooms, writing articles about soft judges. But you've never once considered the human circumstances that bring people before this bench? The tension in the room was palpable. Sarah Martinez watched this exchange, confused about why she had become the center of what appeared to be a long-standing conflict between the judge and the reporter. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished with Santos. Let me tell you something about Mrs. Martinez's case that you didn't bother to research before you came here today with your predetermined narrative. He opened the file on his desk. Mrs. Martinez received this parking ticket on October 15th. Do you know what happened on October 15th? Ms. Santos. Santos shook her head, suddenly looking less confident. That was the day Roosevelt Elementary School had their parent-teacher conferences. Mrs. Martinez was parked illegally because she was 15 minutes late to her son's conference. She was coming from a job interview. An interview for a position that would have allowed her to pay this fine and support her family. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Sarah Martinez's eyes widened, surprised that the judge knew these details. The job interview didn't go well, Ms. Santos. Do you know why? Judge Caprio continued. Because Mrs. Martinez was distracted, worried about that parking meter, worried about being late to pick up her children, worried about making ends meet. She didn't get the job. Santos opened her mouth to respond, but Judge Caprio raised his hand. You want to talk about rules, Ms. Santos? Let me tell you about a rule I follow every day. Before you judge someone, you need to understand their story. Before you condemn someone, you need to know their circumstances. Before you write another article about bleeding heart judges, maybe you should spend a day walking in the shoes of the people who come before this bench. Share this video right now if you believe compassion should have a place in our justice system. Let people see what real leadership looks like. Judge Caprio turned his attention back to Sarah Martinez, whose tears were now flowing freely. But these weren't tears of shame anymore, they were tears of recognition, of being seen, of being understood by someone in a position of power. Mrs. Martinez, Judge Caprio said gently, I'm going to dismiss this fine completely. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs, but Judge Caprio wasn't finished. Furthermore, I want you to take this. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a business card. This is my friend Tony Benedetto. He owns 3 restaurants in Providence. I called him this morning after reviewing your case. He's expecting your call about a management position. Sarah Martinez couldn't speak. She stood there, holding the business card, tears streaming down her face. But Maria Santos wasn't done fighting. Your Honor, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You can't just ignore the law because you feel sorry for someone. What about the restaurant owner who lost money because of her illegal parking? What about the other citizens who follow the rules? Judge Caprio stood up from his bench, his presence commanding the entire courtroom. Ms. Santos, since you're so concerned about fairness and following rules, let me make you an offer. The reporter looked suspicious but nodded for him to continue. I'll pay Mrs. Martinez's fine myself, right now. $300 cash. He reached for his wallet. Will that satisfy your sense of justice? Santos was caught off guard. You can't do that. Judges aren't supposed to. Judges aren't supposed to what, Ms. Santos? Show human compassion? Use discretion? Exercise the very judgment that our legal system was designed to allow. Judge Caprio pulled $300 bills from his wallet and placed them on the bench. There's your fine money. Now let me ask you something else. What have you done to help Mrs. Martinez? What have you done to make the system better instead of just criticizing those who try? Santos stood there, speechless for the first time in her career. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished with his lesson. He looked directly at the reporter, his voice carrying the wisdom of 3 decades of serving justice. You know what the real problem is, Ms. Santos? People like you who confuse cruelty with justice, who mistake compassion for weakness. You think that being tough means being heartless. You think that following the law means abandoning humanity. He gestured towards Sarah Martinez, who was still clutching the business card. This woman made a mistake. She parked illegally. But she's also a mother who is trying to be present for her child's education while desperately searching for work to support her family. The law says she owes money. Justice says she deserves a chance. The courtroom was completely silent now. Even Santos had stopped taking notes. You want to write about this case, Miss Santos? Here's your headline. Judge demonstrates that justice and compassion can coexist. Because that's what real justice looks like. It's not about punishment for the sake of punishment. It's about understanding, accountability, and giving people the tools to do better. But what happened next would shock everyone in that courtroom, including Judge Caprio himself. Maria Santos slowly put down her recording device. Her hands were shaking slightly as she looked around the courtroom, seeing the faces of other defendants waiting for their cases to be called. For the first time in 15 years, she was really seeing them. Your Honor, Santos said quietly. I need to apologize. Judge Caprio nodded for her to continue. I came here today with a story already written in my head. I was looking for evidence to support what I wanted to believe about you, about this court, about the justice system. She paused, glancing at Sarah Martinez. I never considered that maybe I was the one who didn't understand justice. Sarah Martinez, who had been silently listening to this exchange, suddenly stepped forward. Excuse me, she said, addressing Maria Santos directly. Can I ask you something? Santos nodded. Do you have children? Yes, Santos replied. 2 daughters. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between following a rule and taking care of your kids? Santos thought for a moment. Yes, I have. What did you choose? My kids, Santos answered without hesitation. Sarah smiled through her tears. Then you understand. You already know what Judge Caprio did for me today. He chose the kids. The impact of those words hit Santos like a physical force. She looked at Judge Caprio with new eyes, understanding for the first time what she had been witnessing and criticizing for 15 years. Your Honor, Santos said, her voice barely above a whisper. Could I ask you a favor? What's that, Miss Santos? Could you teach me how to see justice the way you do? I'd like to write a different kind of story. Judge Caprio smiled, the kind of smile that had made him beloved by thousands of defendants over the years. Ms. Santos, justice isn't something you can learn from watching. It's something you feel when you remember that every person who comes before this bench is someone's child, someone's parent, someone who matters. He looked around the courtroom. Every person in this room has made mistakes. Every person in this room has needed compassion at some point. The question isn't whether we deserve mercy. The question is whether we're brave enough to give it. Santos picked up her recorder, but this time with a different purpose. Your Honor, if it's okay with you and Mrs. Martinez, I'd like to document this case properly. I think people need to hear this story. Sarah Martinez nodded enthusiastically. If it helps other people in situations like mine, absolutely. Judge Caprio looked at both women, seeing something he rarely witnessed in his courtroom. A moment of genuine human connection across lines that usually divided people. There's one more thing, Judge Caprio said. Miss Santos, I want you to follow up on Mrs. Martinez's story. Check in with her in 6 months. See how she's doing with her new job. See how her children are doing in school. Real justice isn't just about what happens in this courtroom. It's about what happens after people leave here.
Santos nodded vigorously.
I will, Your Honor. I promise. But Judge Caprio had one final surprise that would leave everyone in tears. Judge Caprio reached under his bench and pulled out a small wrapped package. Mrs. Martinez, this is for your children. Sarah opened the package to find 2 books, A Child's Guide to Civics, and Understanding the Law. I want your children to understand that what happened here today isn't about avoiding consequences, Judge Caprio explained. It's about learning that our system works best when we combine justice with compassion, when we remember that laws exist to serve people, not the other way around. He looked at the children, who had been quietly watching from the gallery. Can you 2 come up here? Sarah's son and daughter approached the bench hesitantly. What are your names? Judge Caprio asked gently. Miguel, said the boy. And this is Sophia. Miguel and Sophia, I want you to remember something. Your mother made a mistake today, but she also did something very brave. She came to court, told the truth, and asked for help when she needed it. That's what good citizens do. The children nodded solemnly. And I want you to remember that when people are in positions of power, like judges, like teachers, like police officers, their job isn't to make people feel bad. Their job is to help people do better. Judge Caprio looked back at Maria Santos. Ms. Santos, these children just learned more about justice in 5 minutes than most adults learn in a lifetime. They learned that the system can be fair, that authorities can be compassionate, and that telling the truth, even when it's hard, leads to good outcomes. Santos was now openly crying, her notebook forgotten. Your Honor, she said. I've spent 15 years covering courts and I've never seen anything like this. I don't even know how to write about this. Judge Caprio smiled. Start with the truth, Ms. Santos. Start with the fact that justice isn't about punishment. It's about healing. It's about helping people become the best versions of themselves. He turned to address the entire courtroom. Everyone here today witnessed something important. You saw what happens when we choose to see each other as human beings instead of just cases or problems to be solved. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. Share this story with everyone who needs to remember that compassion and justice can work together. As the formal proceedings concluded, something unprecedented happened in Providence Municipal Court. The other defendants waiting for their cases began applauding. Court officers, who had seen thousands of cases over the years, wiped tears from their eyes. Even the stenographer, who was supposed to remain neutral, was visibly moved. Maria Santos approached Sarah Martinez as they prepared to leave the courtroom. Mrs. Martinez, Santos said, I owe you an apology. I came here today seeing you as a symbol of what I thought was wrong with the system. I never saw you as a person, as a mother, as someone struggling to do the right thing. Sarah took Santos's hand. You don't need to apologize to me, but maybe you could apologize to all the other people you wrote about without really knowing their stories. Santos nodded. I'm going to do more than apologize. I'm going to spend the next year following up on cases, really understanding what happens to people after they leave the courtroom. I want to write about the human side of justice. Judge Caprio, who had been gathering his files, looked up. Ms. Santos, there's something else you should know about Mrs. Martinez's case. Both women turned to listen. This isn't the first time someone couldn't pay their fine. It's not even unusual. What's unusual is that most of the time, people are too embarrassed or too afraid to explain their circumstances. They just plead guilty and try to figure out payment plans they can't afford. He gestured toward the gallery where other defendants were still seated. Half the people in this courtroom today are in similar situations. They're not criminals. They're people caught between following the law and surviving difficult circumstances. Santos looked around the courtroom with new eyes, seeing each person as an individual story rather than just another case number. Your Honor, she said, would it be possible for me to interview some of these other defendants? I think people need to understand that the justice system isn't just about judges and lawyers. It's about real people facing real problems. That's exactly what people need to understand, Judge Caprio agreed. Justice isn't an abstract concept. It's what happens when human beings treat each other with dignity and respect. As they prepared to leave, Sarah Martinez turned back to address the courtroom. Judge Caprio didn't just dismiss my fine today. He gave me hope. He showed me that the system can work for people like us. The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause. Judge Caprio stood and addressed the remaining defendants. What happened today with Mrs. Martinez isn't special treatment. It's how justice is supposed to work when we remember that every case involves real people with real circumstances. Maria Santos was taking notes furiously now, her approach completely different from when she had entered the courtroom. Judge Caprio, Santos said, how do you balance compassion with accountability? Judge Caprio nodded approvingly. Real compassion isn't about ignoring consequences. It's about understanding circumstances and providing tools for people to do better. I connected Mrs. Martinez with an opportunity to improve her situation. That's accountability with support. As the session formally ended, Judge Caprio made one final announcement that would surprise everyone. Ms. Santos, I'm going to make you an offer. If you're serious about understanding justice from a human perspective, I'd like you to volunteer in our community service program. Spend time with people who are working off their fines through community service. See what their lives are really like. Santos looked stunned. You would trust me to do that? After everything I've written about you? Ms. Santos, the fact that you're willing to question your own assumptions tells me everything I need to know about your character. People who are willing to change their minds when presented with new evidence are exactly the kind of people we need in the justice system. The final moments in the courtroom were filled with conversations between defendants, court staff, and Santos, who was now conducting impromptu interviews with people waiting for their cases. The atmosphere had completely transformed from the tense confrontation that had begun the day. Sarah Martinez gathered her children and prepared to leave, but not before one final exchange with Judge Caprio. Your Honor, she said, how can I ever thank you for what you did today? Judge Caprio smiled. Mrs. Martinez, you can thank me by succeeding at your new job, by raising your children to be good citizens, and by remembering to show compassion to others when you're in a position to help. He looked at Miguel and Sophia. And you too can thank me by studying hard, following the rules, and understanding that when you grow up, you have the power to make the system better for everyone. As they walked toward the exit, Maria Santos caught up with them. Mrs. Martinez, she said, I'd like to follow your story, if that's okay with you. Not to exploit it, but to show people what happens when the justice system works the way it's supposed to. Sarah smiled. I'd like that, but I want you to follow other stories too. There are a lot of people who need someone to tell their stories properly.
Santos nodded.
That's exactly what I plan to do. As the courtroom emptied, Judge Caprio sat alone at his bench for a moment, reflecting on what had transpired. In 30 years of serving justice, he had seen many cases that touched his heart, but today had been special. A court officer approached him. Judge, that was something else. I've never seen a reporter change her mind like that in the middle of a story. Judge Caprio looked up. That's what happens when people are willing to listen to each other instead of just waiting for their turn to talk. Ms. Santos came here looking for a story about a soft judge. Instead, she found a story about what justice really means. And Mrs. Martinez? The officer asked. Mrs. Martinez reminded all of us that behind every case is a human being deserving of dignity and respect. That's a lesson we all need to remember. As Judge Caprio gathered his files and prepared to leave, he made a mental note to call Tony Benedetto later to make sure Sarah Martinez's job interview went well. Because real justice, he knew, didn't end when the gavel came down. It continued long after people left the courtroom. The day that began with a confrontation between law and mercy had ended with a demonstration that the two could work together to create something better than either could achieve alone. And in Providence Municipal Court, that lesson would be remembered long after the formal record of the case had been filed away.